So hello to everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you. It is now the top of the hour, so I propose that you settle in comfortably and we will start. So welcome to this online webinar organized by the HEC Lausanne Alumni Association. I thank you for your presence and thank in particular our contributing alumni members whose membership fees allow us to organize this type of event. Before rapidly introducing our speaker of the day, I would like to remind you that this conference is recorded and will be available on the Alumni HEC Lausanne YouTube channel. If you do not want to be seen, just close your video. I ask you to remain on mute simply so we don't have the background noise, and you can ask any questions you may have via the chat by addressing them to myself, !moderator alumni HEC. These questions will be answered in priority at the end of the conference, and time permitting, we will open the discussion live. It is the advantage of being a smaller group to really have a discussion. That being said, I'm thrilled to present the speaker of today, Dominique Honer, who is professor and co-director of the economics department at HEC Lausanne, and who will talk about the impact of climate and on conflict. Dominic Rohner's bio is on our website. You can also find it on his website. So I will not read it out loud, nor enumerate all the institutions, journals, groups he's involved in, nor the prizes and distinctions he has received for his work and research. I will just point out that he is known, renowned, and engaged on armed conflict and peace thematics, and is involved in the new Peace Talk webinars that bring together academia and diplomacy/politics. The next discussion will be tomorrow on Myanmar, which is a very hot topic for sure. And if interested, you can go on their website, peace-talks.org. peace-talks.org. I'll put it in the chat afterwards. Finally, for those who are contributing members of our association, don't miss Professor Rohner's great article on COVID-19 crisis and conflicts that is in our magazine. So that was short, but I hope the essential. And without further ado, Professor Rohner, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction. So let me share the screen. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks a lot for attending, everybody. So can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Yeah, so here I'm gonna present a paper called Heat and Hate, Climate Security and Farmer-Herder Conflicts in Africa. So I tried to make it as non-technical as possible, but there will still be, I mean, given that it's a statistics paper, yeah, it will have some regressions and stuff in it, but given that you all went to HEC, you will appreciate them. So this is joint work with Ulrich Eberle, who I had the pleasure to supervise him as PhD student. He's now in Princeton and at the International Crisis Group, and together with a colleague, Matthias Tönig, who's here in Lausanne as well. So the question we study is, well, what are the links between climate change and herder-farmer violence in Africa, and in particular in the Sahel zone? And in fact, as you've seen maybe in international newspapers, conflict between nomads and settlers have become a major climate security risk. So in past years, these violent disputes between nomadic ethnic groups and settler crop farmers have been fueled very much by droughts and by kind of adverse climate shocks. And even though Boko Haram, you see them kind of maybe even more often in the news, well, these kind of clashes have been actually even deadlier than the Boko Haram events. So to just give an example, like in one event, 200 got killed in clashes between Falata farmers and Ritzegat pastoralists in Sudan, for example. And And the worrying, and it's very worrying that actually the frequency and the intensity of these events has been increasing in the past years. And climate change is kind of likely to further exacerbate violence in the future. And so what we do in this paper is we want to give one of the first quantitative evidence studies on this topic, because so far most of the research has been done kind of more like in terms of anecdotal evidence or qualitative research. And so we want to study this statistically. And we also want to say a few more things about channels and policies that can kind of have been underexplored so far. So let me show you the paper just kind of in one slide, if you like, just to, I mean, that shouldn't encourage you to leave like after 1 minute, but simply kind of to show the results in one slide. So here what you have is the average temperature in the first picture. So you see, as expected, as you would think, Sahara and Sahel zones are particularly hot in terms of temperature, and when you get to the very south of the continent, temperature gets again a bit more moderate. Now, so here you have the temperature patterns, you have the settlement patterns, and that will be a very important element of our study. We use anthropological data from the past to see in what, so we basically cut whole of Africa in little cells, and for each cell we look at what kind of ethnic groups are in this soil, whether these ethnic groups have traditionally had settlement patterns that were nomadic, so kind of they were cattle herders and they went from one place to another to grass the cattle. And the places that only allow for nomadic settlements are like, for example, the Sahara here in blue. So here in blue, in these zones, it's just the vegetation is so harsh, and there is so little food in the soil that basically, yeah, it's hard to do crop farming, and so there you would typically have only nomadic settlements, at least historically speaking. And then you have places with kind of very fertile soils, like you know, the deep forests of Congo, for example, and that's in green here. And there you only have settlements, and in between the two you have a zone where kind of the terrain is kind of a mix between the two and can accommodate for both crop farming, but also for production technologies that are based on cattle herding. And that's kind of in the middle, these kind of mixed settlements where you have some nomadic ethnic groups and you have some settler ethnic groups who do crop farming. And in these kind of areas, in the red areas, well, that's where you would expect resource competition and kind of the threat of conflict between different types of production technologies, because they compete for kind of rare and scarce soil. And when you see here, so what we do in the paper is we estimate the risk of conflict for temperature shock. So what we do is we look at what happens if temperature goes up by 1 degree Celsius in terms of risk for conflict in various places in Africa, for places that have either mixed settlement or non-mixed settlement. And then we combine this with information from climate scientists on how much temperature should increase in different places in Africa until 2040. And what we see is that, well, first of all, the Sahel zone would be a place that is particularly under heat stress for two reasons. First of all, because these mixed settlements, as we show in this paper, increase the risk of climate clashes. And also, secondly, because global warming leads to a somewhat bigger increase in temperatures in the Sahel zone than in other places. So as you know, global warming has heterogeneous effects. In some places, temperature go up more than in others. And in Sahel zone, it goes up disproportionately much. And so for these two reasons, kind of a higher temperature increase and these fueled conflicts of production technologies in mixed settlements, places like the Sahel zone have much bigger risk of increased conflict in the next 20 years, as kind of here shown in red. And so that will be kind of one result of the paper. Basically, do you have any questions on this? No questions? Okay. So let me be more specific then now. So the empirical analysis uses variation over both space and time. So we take Africa and we divide it in little cells of 50 kilometers times 50 kilometers, and kind of looking at the whole continent is good because it gives us much more external validity. While if you just focus on one region of a country, maybe what you find is very true for this region, but it's hard then to extrapolate to other places. And here, by having a whole continent, actually that we can circumvent this problem. Then we have the mode of settlement per cell interacted with annual temperature data. So we look at these temperature shocks for different local areas. Then we're going to look at resource competition, the spread of nomadic violence, and that can help us to document what kind of mechanisms, channels of transmissions are at work. And finally, we're going to look at institutions to see which policies can mitigate conflict. Yes, so yeah, here we go. Yeah. So let me say a few words about the literature. So most of the literature is qualitative in anthropology, etc. There has been a literature on temperature and conflict, where basically scholars like Dell et al. Or Burke et al. have run the regression of looking at the impact of temperature shocks on conflict. So this exists. However, what this kind of ignores, this relationship, is kind of the heterogeneity of the effects when you take into account basically that not all places are the same. In some places you have mixed settlements, while in others you don't. Do you have any questions?
Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. We are a small group, so this can really be an interactive discussion. Thank you, Professor Rohner.
Okay. Yeah. So exactly. The easiest thing is if you just have a go if you have a question. So to summarize what is new in what we do, we unpack the association between heat shocks and conflicts, looking at really this heterogeneity, these subtleties, in particular linked to resource competition between different types of ethnic groups. And it's the first quantitative study of farmer-herder violence that at the same time would look at the causal impact of these temperature causes of violence, look at the role of policy, and also allow to have these modified estimations of predictions on future on climate change, on future conflict. So in terms of data sources, well, we have Africa. We do this little 50.
Maybe can I ask a question real quick?
Sure.
Hi. So I was just, if you just go back, I was not sure. Maybe you did say that. Yeah, here with the causal relationship with conflict, and are you saying that conflict is created because of that, or is it getting more intense, or do you distinguish that somehow? You know, if they already had conflict, or is it really triggered by it?
So I mean, it's a very good question. So basically, what we have is, I mean, the statistical answer is that we just look at whether there's a conflict event in a given year. But given that we have fixed effects at the level of a cell, we kind of filter out the average conflict propensity.
Mm-hmm.
So if in a place there is always conflict, we take this into account by our fixed effects, by our constant term for this cell. So statistically speaking, if you like, what we do is we really look at conflict shocks, a new eruption of conflict, or conflict being more conflict than usual. Now, we also have specifications where we directly control for past conflict, and we could also look for kind of conflict intensification or duration or so. I guess, you know, like now, so that's what we do statistically in this paper. Now, in general, if you look at the whole literature, I guess factors like oil or mining wells or these kind of things are factors where people would think that very often it's something that would kind of prolong conflicts as much as creating conflicts. So it's not just that they create conflict, but they also make them longer. For temperature shocks, given that these temperature shocks are kind of, so we look at the shock in a given year, but we control for the average temperature through the fixed effects. So what we really exploit here are temperature that is higher than the average temperature. So if Congo has always a higher level of temperature than South Africa, then that's something that is accounted for by our regression. But what we really exploit are temperature peaks, where in this given year, Congo has particularly high temperature. And so it's kind of temporary shocks, if you like. So it's more like the idea of looking at the impact of temporary shocks on kind of conflict events spiking in a given year, rather than prolongation of conflict.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much.
So we have these 10,000 cells, 50 times 50 kilometers. It's panel data from 1997 to 2014. We have conflict data that's from ACLED, which is kind of conflict events. So that means that one given war would be composed of several hundreds or thousands of particular events. So if you take the Congo War or the Uganda War, well, one of these wars may have 2,000, 10,000 events, where each battle or each incident would be an event. And for each event, we know where it took place and who was involved and the date of when it took place. And so it's this kind of data that we use to look at the very local level on the conflict intensity. We have temperature data also at these little cell levels. And we have this anthropological data from Murdoch that would tell us for each cell, is there mixed settlement? Is there, do you have in a given cell groups that have a nomadic settlement style with respect to groups that have a settler mode of living and working. And so here there are
sorry, I have a question. So in the previous to this previous slide, there was the link between drought and conflict.
Mm-hmm.
The indicator you have here is temperature. I don't have drought. So you assume that drought and temperature are the same, because the alternative explanation could be that the heat in itself, makes conflict more likely.
So the last slide, if you like, it was a bit of a simplification of the drought. I mean, in terms of the existing literature, I mean, the leaders of this literature are like Salomon Siang, Burke, and Ted Miguel. And in this literature, if you like, the strongest results they found for heat shocks, the impact of heat shocks on conflict. There are some papers that would use the Palmer Drought Index, where that would also look at evaporation. There are also papers that look at rainfall, but rainfall is a bit harder to measure because these rainfall stations, the gorges that would kind of be used as instruments to measure rainfall, are kind of more often destroyed if there are conflicts. So there's measurement error that's non-classical, that's related to the conflict activity. And so, but what we have in mind here, so really the kind of the regression that people run is really very often the impact of temperature on conflict. Drought is obviously linked to temperature, but I agree with you that it's not, that kind of temperature is a proxy linked to drought. And it's true that there can be several reasons why temperature is linked to conflict. So as shown in the literature reviews, one can be this, I mean, the reason we very often focus on economists is the fact that if you have high temperature shocks and drought as well, basically agricultural outcomes suffer. You have bad harvests, producing in your field gives you lower returns, and so you have a lower opportunity cost to leave production and engage in conflict. So that's kind of the thing we focus on, but there are also psychological explanations. For example, they've done lab experiments, for example, where if there's a higher temperature, we're making people more aggressive in the lab. So there is an effect. And if you have kids like me, if they behave in a very nervous way and kind of insult each other around the kitchen table, the thing you do is you tell them, okay, well, take off your pullover. Maybe better to eat just in your t-shirt because maybe that will cool down your behavior as well. So usually it works. So yeah, does that answer your question or not?
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly my point. That there is not necessarily temperature and drought are not necessarily the same, and you indicate, but that's a simplification.
Yes.
Measurements of temperature is much easier than on drought. Thank you very much.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the spirit. So we see it as a proxy for the sake of measurement, basically. Yeah, and then so we have this anthropological data of Murdoch, the ethnographic atlas that looks at historical settlement patterns, and each ethnic group we know where their historical homelands are, and for each group we know what their settlement patterns is, ranging from fully nomadic to kind of completely sedimentary. And so here we take a threshold, we cut at level 2, but we do a lot of robustness check where we take other thresholds to separate between the two types of mode of settlement. And then we have agricultural data as well. So one thing we first wanted to check is, well, does this still have any meaning? I mean, do these ethnographic variables from some decades ago, do they still have any bearing today? Is it really that ethnic groups who traditionally have been more nomadic, are they still nomadic today? Or is it kind of, is now everybody living in a house and nobody does cattle farming anymore? And so that's what we did do here. So we have like the cell share, that is kind of different agricultural quality. And so what we see is that in places that we classify here as nomadic, agricultural land quality is very poor. And so that would be the Sahara Desert, for example. So there, the soil quality is very poor and crop farming is kind of impossible. While in places that are linked to settlers, indeed, still today, the agricultural land is much more fertile and crop farming is possible. And the opposite is exactly the case with infertile soil. So basically what we see is that, well, in terms of the lands that people inhabit today, this still applies. So it's still kind of on average that ethnic groups with historically nomadic style of settlement still inhabit regions that are very hard to farm in terms of crop farming. Yes, and so now basically, yeah, so the regression that is kind of standard in this literature is this, the drought or temperature, if you like. So temperature, we just call it T. So temperature on conflict, and the good thing is that it's kind of econometrically clean, because temperature is not something that I mean short run peaks in temperature is something that is kind of exogenous, and that's not like that conflict would increase temperature. There are some exceptions maybe, but on average it can be seen as reasonably exogenous. So that's kind of the standard regression, and we start with running this. So on the left-hand side in this regression, we have conflict, which will vary at the level of a little cell k and year t, and we regress this on temperature shocks. And we have fixed effects, so that's a constant term for each cell and constant term for each country year, which would filter out all kind of confounders that are linked to a given location or to some given year in a given country. So that means if, for example, a given location, it's close to a river, or it's a place where it's always hotter, or it has sea access, or it has mountainous terrain, all this is picked up by the constant term at the cell level. And if in a given country and year there is an election and there are conflicts linked to an election, for example, that's picked up by the fixed effects at the country year level. And so we run this regression, but then what we're interested, the new thing that we do here is we want to take into account this coexistence of settlers and nomads. And so our story is a bit more complex than the existing story. The existing story is just between drought and conflict. But here what we say is that, in fact, if you have drought and at the same, so adverse heat shocks, and at the same time, you have mixed settlements of two different types of modes of settlements and modes of production that compete, then this magnifies the heat shock. And so that's kind of the thing we want to test. And so the regression that we run, we still have this temperature term that everybody has, but now in addition, on top of that, we interacted with whether in a given cell there is mixed settlement. And so these are the results. So what we find is that if in a given place there is no mixed settlement and there's a temperature shock, like in the blue zone or in the green zone, and there's no mixed settlement, but just a temperature shock, it will still have an effect. And it will increase conflict. 1 degree Celsius will increase conflict by 17 percentage points, by 17%, sorry. However, if the same temperature shock takes place in a mixed cell where you have settlers and nomads, well, there the effect is 3 times bigger, because you add this red coefficient to the blue coefficient, and you end up with actually 54% higher conflict frequency. And that's the case in these red cells, like in the Sahel zone, where basically you have a 3 times bigger effect of a heat shock. And that's kind of policy relevance, right? Because it tells you now with global warming, it allows us to predict where most conflicts may take place, and that allows us to say, oh, in which kind of places we may want to invest resources to help prevent these conflicts, for example. And so now we know for each place, now we know the coefficients. We know that 1 degree Celsius increase in the blue and green cells has a 17% effect, and in the red cells it has a 54% effect. And now we use this information and we combine it with information from geological scientists on climate change that tell us where there is most heating in the next 20 years. And combining this information, our estimates plus the change in temperature in the next until 2040 gives us this prediction, where basically what we find is that if we were to ignore our heterogeneity between settlers and herders, the mechanical increase of conflict due to temperature shocks in general, which is in the order of 1/4. So given that temperature rises and bad temperature is bad news for peace, well, in any case, with the current predictions, we would expect to have 1/4 more conflicts in Africa until 2040 due to climate change. But if on top of that you take into account these mixed settlements where the effects are much bigger in terms of resource competition, there the effect goes up to 1/3. And so it goes up from 26% to 33%. And some countries are much harder hit than others, like Chad, Tanzania, Sudan, etc. So these are kind of the...
Sorry?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Okay.
In the past slide, maybe if you take into account the density of the population, it increases even more the effect of the temperature. Like I don't know.
Very good point. So we have a robustness check on that. I'll show you where we control for population density.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'll show it right later on. So why and where does violence occur? So then as a next, so now that we have these predictions, now we ask the question, well, I mean, why does this take place? Is it just that settlers and nomad groups, they have not gotten along for the last 100 years and it's kind of persistent cultural rivalry and they don't like each other? Or is it due to actual resource competition? And this question is important because, of course, if it was just culture, then it would be maybe a fatality and harder to change. While if it's about resource competition, as economists, maybe we can do something about it in terms of policies. So we have these two things. And for that, we calculate a variable called fringe cells. And the white cells, here, the white cells are cells where basically we have resource competition today, where basically today it's an area that would be suitable for both cattle herding and crop farming. And the red cells are our cells of mixed settlements where historically you have nomadic groups and settler groups. And of course there is overlap. So often in many cases, in places where historically you had resource competition, giving birth to having both settler and nomadic groups, you still have resource competition today, but you have some cells with climate change and desertification and stuff where basically you have resource competition today, but in terms of group composition, you don't have mixed groups, mixed settlements. You only have nomadic or you only have settler groups. And then you have the third case where you used to have resource competition where traditionally you have settler and nomad groups, but today there is no more resource competition. And so given that it's not a perfect correlation between these cells with resource competition today, fringe cells, and with resource competition traditionally with mixed settlements, red cells, we can kind of disentangle between culture and between resource competition. And what we do is, well, I'll maybe skip the regression analysis for the sake of simplicity. What we find is that the key driver is really resource competition. So it's, while culture matters a bit, what really matters, what has the strongest effect is current resource competition. So it's not about people kind of having bad social norms and disliking each other. It's mostly about economics, actually. It's mostly about that climate change puts a heat stress on the soil, and now they have a hard time making ends meet and making a living with this kind of soil stress. And now there is more competition about rare resources, and that kind of fuels conflict. So that's kind of the story that we find in this analysis. And to be more specific, what happens actually is that nomadic groups, given that they have troubles feeding their cattle with these heat shocks, they have to travel further away than they used to. And so here we look at the mobility patterns of the Dinka ethnic groups in Sudan, who's a nomadic, that's a nomadic group. And we look at where they are found to be involved in conflict events. And each conflict event where they are involved is like one dot here. And the dots have a red color if at the moment of this conflict in the homelands of the Dinka group, which is in green here, there is a heat shock where it's very hot, while if at the moment where in this particular period, basically if there is not a heat shock, if it's kind of relatively cold in their homeland, then we have a dot of blue color. And what we see here is that the dots of blue color are kind of on average much closer to the homeland, while the dots of red color are kind of further away, which means that basically in periods of kind of moderate temperature, if they leave their homelands to go somewhere, they kind of remain close to the homelands. They don't have to travel so far to nourish the cattle. While in periods of extreme heat shocks, they have to travel very far away to even foreign countries to find food for their cattle. And so what we see in the regression analysis is exactly that, where if we run a regression on looking at the impact of temperature shock in the homeland on how far they travel, the distance to homeland. And what we see is that the hotter it is in their homeland, the further they travel, and that's particularly true for nomadic group, and that's particularly true when cells where they travel to have water. So it's really a story where groups, I have to go back to the last slide. It's really a story where basically groups have trouble to find food and water for their cattle, and they have to travel further. And this is kind of, you know, if you think of Elinor Ostrom and other research that looks at institutions, informal and formal institutions, what you see is that if two ethnic groups have known each other for centuries, they have typically found ways to kind of cooperate and coexist. So they have informal agreements. And now, however, if heat shocks force the nomadic groups to travel further away from their homeland, and they meet new groups for the first time, with these new groups, they have not undergone any of these informal agreements in the past, and so it's more likely that this can result in conflict events, because well, everything has to be newly negotiated in terms of agreements, and so yeah, so that's kind of the story we have in mind. So how can we prevent conflict? Well, so what we do then as a next step is we take our regression of our variable of interest, which is temperature shocks in mixed areas, and we interact it with policy variables. Here, for example, with high polity scores, it's meaning being more democratic. And what we see is that in places that are more democratic, the effect is smaller. Or in places that have put in place good institutions for land dispute resolution, or places that are less corrupt, or federal states. And we also have similar results for property rights protection. So basically what we find is that, well, these heat shocks lead to an increased risk of conflict due to resource competition, with nomads having to travel further away from their homelands to find food for their cattle, and then there are clashes because they may infringe on some field of some crop farmer, and this leads to conflict. But these kind of conflicts that can escalate and be extremely violent, these conflicts can be reduced if you put in place the right institutions. So democracy, federalism, low corruption, property rights protection, etc. So we're not in a situation of fatality, but we're in a situation where institutions can do the job to kind of prevent fighting. And so let me go back to the conclusion. Okay, thanks so much. So just to summarize, the extreme weather patterns are at the core of this violence, and yeah, it's important to focus on this resource competition to understand what's going on, and really institutions are kind of part of the solution to reduce this kind of violence. Okay, that's it. Thanks a lot.
I'll open up to questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, well then I
have a question.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I really liked the presentation very much. I mean, it looks like it's really frontier research. I didn't know anything about these conflicts or anything, but are there already some NGOs or policies, or I mean, even some governments where you would say there is already something that hasn't maybe been tested, but where people are specifically, doing something, even though you just did this research now, where you could relate to?
Yeah, so very good point. So the thing is, my co-author Ulrich, so he has like this double affiliation in Princeton and in the International Crisis Group. And the International Crisis Group is more like they're more like a policy. They're very policy focused, and they have several papers and projects where they would focus on the anecdotal side of this, and so they would know a lot of the specific situations for each country differently, etc. And so he's kind of in the right place to influence things. So they're very much in dialogue with policymakers. I guess, I mean, in terms of other like technical solutions or other things that could be, of course, kind of potentially interesting, I mean, if you had some chip in some if the cattle would have some chip, some microchip in the ear, like our cats have in Switzerland, for example, that could be something that could already maybe reduce conflict, because you would know exactly where the cattle are, and maybe I mean there may be a scope for technology to help with things, but globally, yeah, I mean, part of the solution is surely good institutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe a related. I mean, I guess I just asking from my own background, and I find it really interesting. It's very convincing, of course, that to focus on the institutions, and of course it's a presentation from an economist, but it would be interesting to think about somehow the role of culture or norm or deeply entrenched behavior that somehow, I don't know, maybe is also, in a specific way changing because of the increasing conflict. I mean, it's not your paper anymore. I just meant like that. I would find that also interesting. But you said there's lots of anthropological research too, where they have discussed these things too, not related to climate change. But
so there is work by, I think, Nathan Nunn.
Yeah.
Nathan Nunn, who has a paper on kind of kind of spirals of retaliation between groups, and kind of explains how in some settings some social norms in some contexts can lead to escalation. So Nathan Nunn has this paper. I don't know if it has been published yet in the meantime, but I mean it's I mean he's like a very famous scholar. So it's kind of an interesting So this will surely become an influential paper. I mean I mean there may be scope for like field experiments, right? I mean like lab in field experiments or something like that. I in my opinion, I mean as far as I know, I don't think there is much. So there's still like room to do that. So to kind of in these societies to where in, like in the Sahel zone where you have the hotspot of this research competition, to see what role culture can play. To do a lab in field experiment would be very cool. So I don't think it exists yet.
Thank you.
We have Bent Bakken who has a question. I'll let you unmute yourself.
So thank you very much. Again, extremely interesting analysis. So my question or comment is more general. So your approach here is to quantify things, and you started with telling us that there's a lot of research, a lot anecdotal and qualitative. So of course, being a former chief scientist of the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment and working on operations research, I find this extremely stimulating. And I think it's very important because for policy making, you need to understand, where the effort should be directed, and you provide an excellent analysis of that. But more generally, do you find that the conflict research in a quantitative manner, which I understand my neighbors here in PRIO, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, has been doing for a long time. And indeed, Johan Galtung, the creator of that, spent several years in Geneva in my time even, I think. So is this quantitative approach something that is growing, or is it still rather marginal in this kind of research?
I think it's growing. No, I think it's growing. I've been several times to Oslo for conferences with PRIO and stuff. So it's a great institution, PRIO. In economics, it's kind of dominant. So in economics. In economics now there are maybe, I don't know, a few hundred people studying conflict, and they focus on statistical evidence. And in political science, I guess it's a mix. So there are several methods that are used, but like in many of the big universities in the US, the quantitative approach on studying conflict is very often used. So yeah, I mean one thing that's kind of one thing that's I guess an evolution in the last few years, on which at least me I'm very fascinated, and I want to push this further, is that a few years ago people have studied mostly things that are not very policy relevant. So things that economists have studied for a long time are things like for example, what's the impact of oil discovery on conflict? And so I understand that the oil discovery, there's evidence on an increase in oil or mineral prices, or oil discovery and these kind of things would increase the risk of conflict due to more rents from natural resources. And this has been studied for a long time, but in some sense, it's kind of, well, it's not so easy to change this. Or people have looked at rainfall shocks. Again, you cannot easily change rainfall shocks, and often they've stopped with this conclusion of what are the drivers of conflict, without kind of asking the question how we can prevent conflict. And so now we have now several groups. So there's one group where I'm the leader of, which is called CEPR, Research and Policy Network, RP. Oh, I can't even write anymore. So let me. Anyway, CPR RPM, Research and Policy Network on Preventing Conflict. So you can find that easily. You can easily Google it if you like. And so in this group, what we really want to focus on is on policies that are relevant. And so, for example, we have paper on education and conflict. We find that building schools in Indonesia was a major factor that would decrease the level of conflict. Or we have looked at democratization, like franchise extension. So or power sharing. So these kind of factors, how democracy or how education, or we've looked at health policies in Africa, whether what kind of health policies can reduce the risk of conflict. So now there is a bit of this movement of being more policy relevant and seeing, okay, so now that we've better understood some factors that would drive conflict, we want to really know what to do to solve conflicts. And so in this group we do that. And I also have this European Research Council grant, the ERC grant on policies for peace, which is in the same vein. And some people for example, Hannes Müller in Barcelona has now created, Halvar Buhaug as well in Norway, have created great tools for conflict forecast to really see, well, where is the risk highest for the next few months or next year for conflict, and what can we, how can we prevent it? So yeah, no, I think this is kind of this quantitative analysis and forecast and trying to quantify things is kind of quite still very often used. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? Please feel free. I do have a question for you, Professor. Can we share these slides with the participants?
Sure, no problem. That's fine.
Okay, perfect. I'll let you send them to me
Yes,
then.
Maybe I have a question for you, Dominic Rohner.
Yes.
My question is, do we observe more conflict on borders, or this has no influence at all?
So I guess I mean there is some work of Michalopoulos, Stelios Michalopoulos and Elias Papagiannou. They have some paper on divided ethnic groups. So what they find is that there are some kind of risk of bad outcomes for groups that have been divided during a period of colonialization, and these kind of artificial borders that have been created, that some of them have kind of had bad impact. So Michalopoulos and Papagiannou are surely, they have a few papers that would kind of study these kind of things. Otherwise, I mean, it's kind of Luis Martinez from Chicago. He has also looked at some topics a bit related to that, where he has found like linked to Colombia, for example, that in the border region that sometimes is kind of used as a hiding ground for rebels from one country hiding in the other country, and these kind of borders makes it harder to kind of for a state to really kind of fight rebellion. So that's Martinez has worked on it, and we have a paper together with Caselli and Morelli where we study the impact of oil on interstate conflicts. And what we find there is that if in a country pair, you have one country that has oil very close to the border, and the other country has either no oil or oil very far away from the border. So if you have an asymmetry in location, then that's something that's a very big predictor of conflict. And the logic is the following: is if you're the country that has the oil very far away from the border, for you attacking me with the oil close to the border is kind of a good deal, right? You can grab my oil if you win, and if you lose, given that your oil is kind of secure far away from the border, the kind of the risk you take are not that big. And so yeah, there are some things going around borders. So there are a series of papers that would look kind of related to borders.
Okay, thank you.
Professor, to what extent does this paper also apply to other parts of the world, whether South America or other parts?
Yeah, so I think I mean in general I guess one of the reasons why in several of these papers we focus on Africa is mostly that the data is very good. So it's like this ACLED data on conflict covers the whole of Africa, and but it doesn't cover all other countries of the world. So then there are other data sets like UCDP-GED from Uppsala and Oslo. So there are other data sets as well, but often the kind of one of the reasons why we focus on Africa is kind of it's just linked to data quality and data availability. But I think no, that there's no reason why I would expect that this plays less of a role in some parts of Asia or. I mean, one of in the big scheme of things, one big predictor of conflict is of course poverty. So if you just look at if you have a map of the whole world and you look in which countries there have been conflict in the last 50 years, civil wars, what you see it correlates very strongly with income. So of course you would have less conflict in North America and Western Europe, etc. So in kind of very rich areas, and the reason is, I mean, one of the reasons is a question of opportunity cost, right? I mean, if now if I'm in the middle of a drought and my fields don't give any yields and we have troubles to find food for the next day, it's much easier to recruit me to start some rebel movement than if I'm sitting comfortably in some office in Lausanne or Geneva and have a good salary, and then it's very kind of harder to recruit. So that's kind of makes conflict much more. You know, if you wanted to start some rebel movement in Switzerland, it would be much harder. It would be much less feasible than if you do that in a place where there's a lot of oil and a lot of poverty. Because in Switzerland, I mean, you know, you have a bigger state capacity, you have higher salaries, soldiers want to be paid. So kind of being a rich country is kind of something that prevents a lot of conflict. So clearly, if you run the same regressions for North America, or for Switzerland, of course, you would find much less of a result because the wealth is kind of plays a big role. But if you look, if you were to run the same regression for the whole of Asia, for example, I would be surprised if the results were very different, frankly. But that's pure speculation, so I don't know. We haven't done it.
We are getting to the top of the hour. We can take one more question.
I have a question. I don't know if this is so relevant, but if I understood correctly, so the nomads are the ones who move further away when there is a soil stress. But I was wondering if the conflicts are more between the nomads or are nomads and settlers in other regions?
So we have regressions where we have regressions where we look at nomads only, and I mean, so by the way, the regressions on population density that I promised and never showed what was here. So when we control for population density, the results are kind of unchanged for mixed settlement. But what we also do in these robustness checks is we also focus on where is that on nomads only, and for nomads only we don't find an effect actually. So it's not like resource competition between nomads is not the driver of conflict. It's really about mixed settlement. And the way we think about it is that, you know, like if you look at the work of Ronald Coase, the Nobel Prize winner Ronald Coase, what he talked about was for when he talked about property rights, he gave an example of some cattle farmer in Britain, I think, or somewhere, cattle farmer and some crop farmer. And one has the field and the other has the cattle, but the cattle walks on the field and destroys the cereal production. And so now the question is, who has the property rights, the cattle farmer or the cattle herder or the crop farmer? And basically what this illustrates, this example of Coase, is that really the potential conflict of clashes of production functions is kind of more intense between herders and settlers, in the sense that even if we are two herders, if I'm a cattle herder and you're a cattle herder and we go further away somewhere in the Sahara, well, to the extent that there is still some grass to eat, our two herds of cattle may not lead to huge competition. While so my grassing may not disturb you that much. However, if my cattle come to your field where you kind of plant corn or something, then the destruction may be bigger and the conflict. So that's kind of the idea. But yeah, what we find is just it's not about nomads per se, but it's really about the interaction of nomads and settlers.
Thank you very much. If you still have a minute, I have a question for you, which is more on a personal level. Why did you decide to focus on climate and conflicts?
So I mean, conflict I've been focusing on since secondary school. The first topic I could choose when I was 12 was like on conflict or something. So I've studied it forever. But environmental issues is something I've also been studying more and more in the last 5 years or so. So now, like in the last few years, I not only study conflict, but I also study environment issues. So we have now in this E4S center. So I don't know if you've heard about that. That's a really cool thing. E4S is like UNIL, EPFL and IMD together. And there we have, in this E4S center, we have a group on evidence-based environmental policies. And so there, yeah, I also now do much more on environmental policies, because it's kind of, I feel that these are like the maybe two or three big topics at the moment for kind of things that threaten the world, right? Conflict and environmental problems, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise. It was extremely interesting. And what I love about these webinars is the diversity in the subjects. And I'll use that line to just announce the next webinar, which will be on Thursday, April 29th at 12 noon. And this time we're going to talk about megatrends in the investment world and how to invest in them, with 2 alumni who will be telling us. And one of them is very into smart farming and food tech. So it's not the same thing, but it is kind of linked to farming as well. So thank you so much, Professor Rohner, for your time. It's been a thrill, and we look forward to hearing you soon again. Thank you very much to all.
Yeah, thanks a lot to everybody.